This next session is the broad theme is policing porn, and there are three of us speaking, so myself first, Clarissa Smith second, and Lucy Neville third. And we're talking about porn, looking at it from different aspects, and the policing of porn from different aspects. What I'm going to talk about is anti-porn campaigns. I'm going to talk about stop porn culture as a campaign in particular. And there's a kind of very obvious starting point to this, which is that anti-porn campaigns, not just feminism ones, but anti-porn campaigns of all kinds, have often campaigned for porn to be regulated in various different kinds of ways. And so that kind of that goes back, that has a long history. And right up to kind of groups in the UK campaigning specifically about porn and what people sometimes refer to as pornified culture, sexualised culture, porn culture, sex object culture, all of those things. That tradition is kind of very much alive and kicking. What I'm not going to talk about are regulatory controls, particularly, but what I want to talk about is the kind of the character of this contemporary campaigning, so the kind of sensibility of it, the way that it operates, what its elements are, what kind of ideas seem to underpin it. And the reason for that is that I think it's important as feminists to be quite clear about how campaigns work, where the ideas that they use come from, how they operate, what impact they have on debates, and how we want to intervene in that sort of general set of debates. So, to start with, one of the things that's really notable about stop porn culture as a campaign is this kind of thread that runs through it, which is about the campaign being based on common sense. We're all sitting here with our common sense. We can look at the material, think about the messages it's sending, and reason our way through to at least some tentative conclusions. This is a kind of theme that runs not just through this campaign, but through a number of books written by writers in this area, campaigns in other countries. The idea that actually to be anti-porn is kind of obvious. It doesn't need explanation. It's not difficult. It doesn't need unpacking. We just kind of know something's wrong and we can operate on that basis. The kinds of language that are used, material that sends out messages. Again, this very kind of common sense of what media is and how it works as a set of things that sends out some messages. Very old-fashioned way of thinking about media. So common sense is a really kind of key, important element to this kind of campaign, not something that needs a lot of discussion or debate. And that kind of impacts on the way that facts and figures are used in this campaign. And in fact, this isn't at all specific to anti-porn feminist campaigns. Facts and figures are used in quite a bizarre way, I think, in campaigns against pornography of all different kinds. And I think it's because it's the idea is that you don't really need to debate anything about pornography. But facts and figures are not used in a way that would be recognised in any other kind of evidence-based, where they actually matter. They bear any relation to things that can be checked. They're largely what people refer to as zombie statistics. A zombie statistic is a factor that keeps being repeated over and over again. Often can't be traced back to anything. It's become accepted that we all know that 80% of something does one thing, or 67% of girls think another thing. But there's no origin of it. It's kind of lost in the mist of time where it comes from. A lot of the facts and figures have not been checked, they're guessworks, they've been taken from one thing and worked up, multiplied in some way. They're very often very out of date, so they're either hugely underestimating or hugely overestimating things, or they misinterpret original sources. And they take on a life of their own. So it doesn't matter how many times somebody carefully unpicks that and says, well, this came from a thing that was written in 1982 that was discredited at the time, but it's, it carried on. So the facts and figures are not there as evidence. They're there almost as kind of a hyperbolic thing to kind of, they're almost as part of a sort of sensation creating thing. This is how big, this is how important, this is how scary this topic is. But they don't really relate to things that are checkable or knowable or based in evidence. The other sort of strong element that runs through this kind of campaigning is its reliance on testimony and the stories of individual people. And this has a very strong link to the idea that in this area, feeling and a kind of emotional truth are really important. So it's part of this general idea. It's commonsensical. Facts and figures don't matter unless they kind of express common sense. You ask people for their feelings, and you find individual stories. This is where you get the truth about the matter. And of course, it's not everybody's stories. It's only a particular set of people who get to tell stories. And so again, we've got here, and I think increasingly this kind of campaigning has become very anti-academic, very sort of increasingly kind of explicitly hostile to academic work, to research, as if as if there's this kind of inevitable separation between women on the one hand and academics on the other, or feminists on the one hand and academics on the other, as if these are distinct groups. So we get things like, if you give examples of what women say or feel or think, academics will say that can't be true because it hasn't been researched, or show me the evidence of that, which minimises women's feelings and reactions. So feeling takes precedent, and the testifying of feeling takes precedent. And this element has been remarked on by a number of feminist scholars, actually, as something that runs through not just campaigns against pornography, but campaigns against sex education, for example, which are very highly charged, and which take the form of almost kind of performances of public feeling, where people are shamed in public, where there's anger, where people get very frightened, where there's feelings of dread and scariness, and where there's kind of collective rage. So it's a kind of debate that's really strongly effective. It's also, though, bizarrely, because it's seen as, this is the truth, this is people's real feelings, it's very highly scripted. So Janice Irvin, who studied public meetings about sex education in the States, found that people would say almost exactly the same things at the time. It was almost like there was a formula for expressing this kind of feeling. And this kind of debate does a particular set of things. It kind of wipes out research. It kind of wipes out feminist activism. Lynn Segal remarked on when the debates about sexualisation were at their peak a few years ago in the UK. And you have not just campaigning groups, but you have policy reports coming out saying, this is what's happening to girls, this is women's experience, this is what we should do. It's as though the last 40 years of feminist and other scholarly contention around the body, sexuality and representation simply never happened. It kind of loses all contact with disagreements that have been going on, advances that have been made, new ways of thinking about things, new research methods, differences within feminism, different kinds of feminist protest, different stances on all sorts of issues. It's as if they're not there anymore. They just kind of disappear under the weight of this feeling. Lisbeth van Zoonen has also noted how the debates become devoid of intellectual memory. So the fact that people, by and large, don't talk about media as sending out messages anymore, and probably haven't done for 60 or 70 years, gets lost in all of this highly charged atmosphere. And I think this is perhaps one of the reasons why this kind of campaign and its style, it kind of becomes very cut off from any moorings. And it can move around, it pops up in all sorts of unexpected places. People sometimes talk about the history of alliances between particular kinds of feminist campaigners and religious and right-wing campaigners. But I think over and above that question of whether they do form alliances or not, I think it's the fact that the tenor of the debate is so kind of not rooted in feminism and so not rooted in evidence that it can kind of move around and get caught up in all sorts of different campaigns. So this is from a parliamentary conference pack, which was organised by Safer Media, who are a highly conservative kind of morality and media group, using the work of Gail Dines in a sealed envelope marked, you may find the contents of this envelope distressing, in order to gain some political leverage. And you have, kind of a very sort of bizarre collection of interests coming together in that moment. Not necessarily a question of alliance, but a question of a debate that's kind of just not grounded in anything very much anymore. You have work like the work by Melinda Tankard-Weiss, who edited a collection on sexualisation a few years ago, popping up in Christian groups, where girls are talked to about being sex objects while the men go off and do some blokey, godly things together. Again, kind of a very bizarre sets of things coming together. And you have coalitions like this, one which is organised by a morality and media group in the States, bringing together a coalition which is made up of pro-family organisations, religious leaders, women's rights and feminist activists, child advocacy, etc., 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 groups that actually probably have very little else in common, but this topic, coming together to end sexual exploitation with a very particular take on what that means. Okay. These kind of elements, I think, have been present in anti-porn feminist campaigns, or some anti-porn feminist campaigns, for a long time. So they've got a real tradition behind them. And what I want to go on to talk about is the way that one particular strand, which has been there before in these campaigns, the focus on public health, is starting to become more important, and what that might mean, how that frames the discussion about pornography, and how it then gets policed or regulated or thought about, perhaps in new ways. And just to sort of talk about the context of that in the UK, you may be aware of this national survey that is carried out every 10 years, the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, and it's an attempt to take a sort of snapshot of what people in the UK think about sex and how they practice sex and so on. The most recent survey came out quite recently, and at the launch, the team made this statement: 25 years on from the first NatSal feasibility study, we have moved a long way from the political ban that nearly prevented the first survey, this was a ban by Margaret Thatcher, to a position in which sexual lifestyles are increasingly recognised as a mainstream and legitimate focus of public health policy, practice and research. And you can see kind of in the focus of if you look at how those surveys have changed over the years, they start with a very kind of disease-focused approach, which is about how we've got to take an interest in sex because people might have diseases, and then it moves to something that's more focused around function, the idea that people can function sexually, and now it's moved to this idea of lifestyle and well-being, that sexual lifestyles are something in and of themselves that we need to investigate. It's kind of an important part of people's sense of themselves, who they are, their identity, their general healthiness. And one of the announcements that the NatSal team made was that the next survey would focus much more heavily on media and cultural issues, so the internet, sex tourism, pornography, media representations. And one of the things that was much remarked on in the news coverage of the survey, which is where these two images were from, was this idea that people are perhaps not having as much sex as they used to because they're too busy with their gadgets. So, women are taking their iPads to bed, they're not having real sex because of technology. So you can see how that debate has shifted, and the idea of sex as a public health issue, but very much in terms of lifestyle rather than disease and dysfunction, has become a much more mainstream set of concerns. So it's interesting to see how anti-porn campaigns change alongside these. These are the bookmarks from the Stop Porn Culture website. And apart from the links to anti-porn writers, the two that are kind of singled out are both within this area, really, of this idea of public health, in very different ways, and it's really interesting how these kind of play out. So this is one of them. It's from Wendy Maltz's site. Wendy Maltz is a sex therapist, and she runs a site called Healthy Sex. And this is her definition of healthy sex, and the illustration that goes with it, so you can see what healthy sex looks like. Sexual energy is a powerful, very natural force in our lives, but like any natural force we encounter, be it wind, sun, rain, or our own laughter, our sexual energy has the potential to be channeled and experienced in either destructive or life-affirming ways. And then she goes on to explain, because we live in a society that is constantly bombards us with images of sex that have very little to do with healthy sexuality, it's no wonder that. And then all of these kind of sexual ills, which include abuse, addiction, porn problems, exploitation, diseases, unwanted pregnancy, and chronic sexual unhappiness, are attributed to media representation. That's quite an odd view, I think, of sexuality. Again, when you think, you know, the kind of comments that have been made devoid of intellectual memory, decades and decades of people thinking about sexual identity, sexuality, sexual practices. Here it's a natural force like laughter or the wind. The other strand, which is, of course, very prominent, this is the other link, that takes up pornography as a matter of public health, sees pornography as a form of addiction. As these are some of the resources that are linked to from the site. So we have a real focus on brains. And again, this time it's not about natural forces, it's about wiring, chemicals, what's in your brain, what happens when an adolescent brain meets internet porn. Evolution hasn't prepared us for today's internet porn. But again, I mean, based on this premise that there's something natural, there's a kind of natural sexuality, like the wind, sun, laughter, and so on. And then there's the artificial stuff that makes it all go wrong. So people who go in for the whole addiction thing talk about the concept of rebooting. You have to reboot your brain. And that means no artificial sexual stimulation during your reboot. And by artificial, I mean pixels, audio, and literature. If it's not real life, just say no. So again, you've got this separation. Sex is over here, and it's natural, and we all know what that means. It's complete common sense what sex is. And all this other bad, artificial stuff is over here, and it's the thing that makes everything go wrong. There's a very clear kind of gender dimension, I think, to these two views of public health and porn as well, with this being, you know, particularly aimed at men, whereas the wind and the beaches and the sun and the laughter is much more kind of targeted at female readers. So it's not really surprising, given that context, that Stop Porn Culture is moving much more towards a kind of rebranding as a public health campaign. Some of the recent conferences, a conference that's coming up this summer, specifically takes this idea of public health and porn. We are a public health campaign raising awareness that all pornography is violence against women. What is getting traction in the United States is a public health campaign. We're making links with child protection groups and disease control. We're working to expand that with educators. And of course, I mean, campaigns, I guess, have to find traction where they can. They have to make use of what is around in order to gain more visibility, in order to make themselves visible within debates. But I think it's very hard to actually see what these elements, or health conceptualised in these particular kinds of ways, what they actually have to do with feminism, why they might be related to feminist thought, or traditions of feminist thought, or feminist approaches in any particular way. And so really what the question that I want to raise from this is, if we want to have feminist debates and campaigns that are related to pornography, that are interested in evidence, that don't think that pornography and sexuality are a matter of common sense, that are grounded in politics and a history of feminist politics, that don't ignore academic work and feminist thinking of the last 40 years, what would that actually look like? And I think, I mean, the point is that I'm not saying we don't know because nobody's ever talked about these things. Actually, we do know because those debates have been going on all the time. It's not that that there aren't discussions about what constitutes health in the kind of society we live in, or how might you measure well-being. What can different disciplines contribute to an idea of what it is to be a healthy person or to live a healthy life and so on. But that those conversations tend to not be very visible in public discourse. And so, I mean, that's really just where I want to end, to say that there is kind of this rather bizarre depoliticised discussion going on around pornography that looks feminist on the surface but isn't underpinned by anything recognisably feminist. And then there are a whole set of other conversations deriving from feminism that are kind of a bit left out of that public debate. Okay, I'm going to end there.
Okay, we've got just time for 1 or 2 questions before we move on to Crystal. We'll have time at the end to come back to it. Yeah, Julia?
Yeah, thank you for that. I share your sense of maybe feeling that it's rather dubious to use these terms like healthy and unhealthy and kind of authentic and inauthentic. I totally agree. I think that can be used in really sort of quite dubious ways. But I suppose just to draw attention to the fact that I hear a lot of very kind of the terms being used like sex positive or very sort of like, you know, feminists who are playing a kind of very pro-porn position actually replicating those same sort of terms. So like on the channel for Queer Porn TV that you have advocates there talking about documenting super healthy sex and the kind of claims around authentic sexuality. So just to observe really that I think these very problematic terms are kind of being taken up and used in quite deeply decided ways sort of from, you know, from both ends of the spectrum, I would say.
Thank you very much for your talk. For me, I suppose there was also an echoing, which perhaps in a microcosm might be looked at in Lily Allen's recent music video, It's Hard Out Here for a Bitch, which is supposedly her positioning herself as a feminist and making a spoof piece which she calls that it was supposed to be a little bit of fun. And then there was lots of debate about it not being feminist and being actually racist against the black dancers in the video, and it was a very interesting conversation. But in that, you know, she was putting herself forward as this, you know, powerful pro-woman, but actually didn't seem to have any idea about the histories of those conversations that were being had. And there was a brilliant Guardian article about it where they were like, you know, I seem to have lived through all these years of, you know, academics talking about white women's messages written over black bodies, and that's just being completely ignored. But I do think that there is still a conversation about accessibility and academia, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about how, certainly I feel like I'm part of a generation that is media obsessive, and that we're getting very used to receiving information in certain language and in certain forms, and I think that isn't academic and that it doesn't give us the tools to be able to read into academic theory and to be able to gain that knowledge and get that grounding, and where you feel that the accessibility is how that's pushed forward from an academic grounding.
I suppose, I mean, I think one of the things I think is that those conversations aren't just happening in academia. I think, you know, there are lots of really interesting conversations going on, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, about, you know, that have really questioned what is, you know, what do we think, what do we mean by gender, what do we mean by sexuality. There are all sorts of different communities and groups that are not necessarily academic who are debating those things in very lively and articulate ways. And I think there's a kind of I take your point that you know, there might be lots of stuff that's happening in academia that maybe doesn't get out there, but I don't think that's the only place that it's happening. I think there are really interesting discussions. I mean, amongst sex workers, amongst porn performers, amongst porn producers, amongst porn consumers, for example, about what might be ethical in this situation, or how things might be done alternatively, or how we decide what the meaning of a particular text is. I think those things are happening elsewhere in a much more grounded and lively way that don't fall into that trap that you just mentioned of assuming, well, we all know what feminism looks like, and it's Lily Allen's version of it. So I think it's not just academia versus the rest. I think politically we're living in interesting times.
I think we'll leave there. We'll come back for questions after the next few.
Okay.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, and I think it follows on quite nicely from Fiona's paper, is about moves that are currently happening in government at the moment to criminalise the possession of what is termed rape porn in government. So I'm not actually really going to talk about fantasy, but I think there are interesting things that maybe we could talk about afterwards in terms of the problems around thinking about fantasy as it relates to pornography. What I actually want to talk about are the moves towards the criminalisation and what that might mean for everyone across the spectrum, actually, because I think that there are some very significant problems in what's actually happening in government right at the moment. So where this starts from is basically, it's not great to be able to read that, but last summer a letter was sent to the Prime Minister by Rape Crisis South London, in which it asked him to urgently close a loophole in the extreme pornography legislation in the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act 2008. And this is the loophole which has been identified by two legal scholars at Durham University, which is that it allows for the depicting of rape or images that appear to be of rape. Now, I don't know how many people know the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act 2008, I don't want to go into all the details, but Section 63 criminalised the possession of images which were deemed to be produced solely for and consumed solely for the purposes of sexual excitation, and which featured the real or apparently real damage to breasts, genitals and anus. So it also includes provisions around having sex with a corpse or with animals. And this can lead to 3 years in jail if you're caught in possession of that. Now, at the time that that legislation went through, actually, there was quite a bit of debate about whether or not this was a good thing, whether or not this was reasonable. And it does, in fact, change British law quite significantly to criminalise possession, because previously the problems had been about distribution or production, and of course possession then very much individualises the law as a matter of it's not people making money from this material, but it is people who might be looking at materials. And there are elements in the new provisions as well that are likely to ensure that it's not even a case of having looked at the material at all. Simply the fact that it is on your computer means that you are in possession of it, right? So that actually has implications for everybody, really. But at the time that law was being debated, it arose out of a particularly sad case, Jane Longhurst's murder by a guy called Graham Coots, and was designed to close down necrophiliac sites and other sites where extreme in the terms of the law, sexual activities were taking place. At that time too, it was expected that there would only be 30 or so prosecutions per year. That's been well and truly surpassed. It's been in operation for 5 years now, and there have been at least 2,000 prosecutions under the provisions. Most of those about bestiality, it should be said. Okay, so the letter went to the Prime Minister. It has a number of suggestions in it about why a law is necessary, and in particular drawing on a particular idea of the ways in which rape porn appears online. It was based on some research, but one piece of research which borrows quite heavily, I think, from earlier kinds of traditions of research, which takes quite literal views of the material that it purports to examine. But I actually don't particularly want to go into whether or not what might be the problems of that particular research, because what interests me most is actually how, in fact, that those elements of it have been evacuated as the provisions have been debated in Parliament. Right. So the key thing here for the proponents of the law is that sexual violence is a form of entertainment which causes huge cultural harm to our society, and we urge you to take action to close this loophole. Now, I don't know whether many of you were watching TV around the 22nd of June last year, but David Cameron appeared everywhere talking about how he's making this move to protect women from representations of rape online, that this was going to be a significant move in closing down and preventing violence against women, and that also he was going to be stopping the tide of poisonous materials. His term was that these images are literally poisonous to the children who view them. And one of the things that there was a petition that went alongside the letter as well, which got 74,000 signatures. And that might seem quite a lot, but actually it isn't. In one day, a campaign to ensure that legal aid would not be removed from most petitions in law, that achieved 3 times this amount of signatures in just one day. Right? So I think you know, in terms of numbers, and this isn't about whether or not you know, this should move. It is actually about the realpolitik, really, and the attempts by Cameron to paint himself as women-friendly that I find quite problematic. Right? There are lots of other things, and indeed, I think, you know, rape crises have been an incredibly important activist group and service provider to women who have no doubt asked David Cameron for all kinds of things, but this is the thing that he agrees to do. And I think that is somewhat problematic. So, taken up in the news, of course, the Mail, the Daily Mail, who always gets an honorary mention in any of these discussions about law and pornography and new media and those sort of things. In fact, they claimed it as a victory for themselves, interestingly enough. And we could talk a bit about the Mail and its contradictory ideas about females, women, and what's appropriate behaviours. And then this idea that they are also protecting women. But also the BBC, various reportages of women's campaigners, the Huffington Post here, looking at rape porn will become a new crime, says David Cameron, this is from the Daily Mirror. And also in various online news outlets as well, so talking about, and the fact that this would be punishable by jail. in America, they point out in the Atlantic that people in the UK who have porn showing fake rape could get as much jail as real rapists in America. So the thing that struck me particularly about most of that reporting, which is actually the fact that there was no debate about whether this was necessary. Even the article which says, you get as much time for looking at simulated rape as you would for actually committing one, doesn't in fact go into any debate around what might rape porn be. Right? It's assumed as a category, that it can be read literally off its face, and that there is, a very problematic relationship between fantasies of rape, and here actually I want to make it quite clear, I don't think in terms of just fantasy. I think that fantasy is a very enormous subject that we ought to be debating, but we don't, that we ought to be understanding, but we don't, and that the questions about whether or not something breaks the boundaries of fantasy, if there are any boundaries indeed, moves into reality. These are all issues that we ought, in fact, to be debating. But just as Fiona was pointing out in relation to more widespread talk about pornography, there is a way in which all of the debates that have occurred in media studies, in discussions amongst feminists actually about reality and fantasy as it relates to rape, in terms of novels, films, and other kinds of representations, all of that gets washed out and is lost. And one of the things that was particularly interesting is the kind of consensus and the idea that there can be nothing that's worth exploring or understanding or indeed defending in terms of wanting to look at imagery of rape, coerced sex, forced sex, or seduction, actually. These all get rolled up into one thing. So this is a below-the-line comment from the Independent, which I think is just, I'm using it really as kind of typical. And, of course, what happens, the law went to its second reading in the House of Parliament and then entered the committee stage. And a few people made representations to the committee, not a lot, a handful of people, and the committee then met in March to debate whether or not these provisions should go through. And this is what happened in the committee stage. You can go and have a look for yourselves, it's all available online. It's actually rather dull, there's an awful lot of stuff. This is one of those portfolio bills, actually. It's a criminal justice and courts bill that's going through, and Amendment 16 relates to possession of rape pornography. So there's an awful lot of talking about all sorts of things, but what is particularly striking is that this attempt to criminalise rape porn is going through with the absolute minimum of debate. There were three pieces I could find that took an oppositional stance to ban. The top one is about tech, about it being unworkable. The second one is Louise mentioned, I wouldn't normally agree with, but anyway, there are elements that I do in terms of how badly drawn this law is. And we should be clear that the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act, which is expands, is a really badly drafted law. And then a later piece which was in defence of rape fantasy. I'm running out of time and I need to move on. So, here we go. The first person to give evidence to the committee was Sue Burroughs, who is the Children's Commissioner. And so she's introduced to the committee. Thank you for inviting me here to give evidence this morning. She says who she is. I should add, given the context today, that I chaired our national inquiry into child sexual exploitation in gangs and groups, hence I am able to talk about rape pornography. And that's all she gets to say on the matter. That is it, nothing else in the session that she's in. Then the Survivors Trust, after the following day, and Faye Maxted introduces herself. The bits of the bill that we particularly welcome are the change to the definition of extreme pornography to include depictions of rape or penetration. I think that that is particularly welcomed across the board. That's not all she gets to say. She does get to say a few other things. Much later on, I'm sorry, you can hardly read that. Okay, so Dan Jarvis, one of the MPs there, asks, can I ask you for a bit more detail about why you welcome the provision? Is it your view that the clause in its current form is fit for purpose, or can it be improved in any way? I have one concern, which is that the defence that consent was given might be used. I'm not sure how consent might be evidence or how it might be judged, but consent was given to the acts that are depicted. And then a further question. On that point, like you, I welcome the inclusion of that provision in the bill. I want to build on what my colleague just said. Do you think that other aspects of violence against women should be included in the definition? Does current legislation adequately protect children from being abused and prevent images of child abuse? Or should child abuse be a specific offence in the clause on the possession of extreme pornography? The thing that's particularly worrying about these very short interventions here is that actually Sarah Champion is drafting or is part of the committee that is proposing this to Parliament for its third reading, and yet she seems not to know that there are a whole raft of legislative statutes all in operation currently which do adequately protect children from, images of child abuse, right? I mean, the fact is that we don't as a society do enough to protect children from being abused. All sorts of images, any image of a child is now illegal, right? Engaged in sexual activity of whatever kind. So there's no necessity for this law to add that clause. The issue about consent, well, if we were talking about professionally produced pornography, and that seems to be what people are talking about, then in fact consent is obtained. We can find out whether or not consent has been given. So given the discussions this morning, maybe we need to rethink issues around consent. So Faye Maxted, who has been brought in as an expert, says yes, she would welcome the inclusion of images of child abuse. Children should be included in this bill. And then again, she returns to defence of the defence of consent. Now that is, in its entirety, the discussion that has been had with those two women on the law. And then there was a third day in which there was an invitation to a group to come and speak about the law, and that was the BBFC. The BBFC had a slot of 30 minutes, and they actually spoke for 8 minutes, and then everybody went to lunch. No one seemed to be interested in debating anything. No one was asking any questions about the particular clauses in terms of realism or what is real in representation, what might be considered real fantasy. And in fact, all the BBFC did was tell the committee that they see some nasty things and that they don't pass them. So in fact, actually, what were they saying in terms of additional material for this law? What I find particularly striking is the fact that even those people who were proponents of the law have not been invited in to speak to the committee, that they have not been a part of this public debate. That ought to worry us about how moves are made. And in fact, it's very clear reading the detail in the committee that there is just an assumption that because David Cameron is very much behind this bill, as the chair of the committee put it, the Prime Minister is minded to push this through, then this is a law that will come into operation. And it has not been debated, and it also has not been evidenced. There is one piece of evidence that is being used, and that is the piece produced by Rape Crisis South London, and nothing else has been admitted. Some of us have made representations to the committee on that basis. It might seem, I should make a declaration here, because it might seem like sour grapes that I'm talking about not having been invited to go along, but that's neither here nor there. Actually made a submission to the committee, but none of those issues have been discussed. And it should also be pointed out that the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act was based as well on no real evidence. What was produced was a rapid evidence assessment, which was a perfect example of policy-based evidence, not evidence-based policy. And what's happening now, right in this moment, now the committees have all finished meeting, and there will be the third reading in the House of Parliament, and then it'll move to the House of Lords, is actually a jockeying to be seen as the most hard line, really. And so Labour have released a couple of press releases in which they're saying that Cameron is falling short of his promise to ban internet rape porn. And again, this is not about whether or not, it's not any discussion here about images of rape, the particular issue that various other feminist proponents of the law had suggested, but is about whether or not children are going to be protected. As I've said already, there are a raft of laws that actually do that work already. And the Daily Express, in an attempt, I guess, to overtake the Daily Mail, took the issue, took the presentation by the BBFC and used it to say that, in fact, the BBFC, the censors, are okaying rape porn currently, so long as it's unrealistic and badly acted. This is not actually what they said, though one of the things that they pointed out is that the phrasing of the law, as it currently stands in terms of realistic depictions, means that there is a possible defence, which is that if it is unrealistic and badly acted, there is a means of getting out of it. But there are wider concerns here, really, about what happens when ideas are taken and used in particular ways by members of government. What are their motivations, and how, in fact, does particular concerns, academic concerns, activist concerns, participants' concerns, get wiped out in an assumption that, in fact, lawmaking is simply for the lawmakers. And I think I'll leave it there.
Time for one or two questions.
I wonder, with the rape porn, is there any evidence that people watching rape porn are more likely to commit rapes? And if so, shouldn't we be banning watching shoplifting on TV or watching murder in crime dramas, and all those kind of things are going to lead to crimes of those nature?
Well, I mean, it is a really interesting question about, media obviously have real importances for people in their lives, right? But this is the only area in which actually we talk about legislating because something is illegal to commit, and then that somehow people watching it will not recognise it as illegal. And in fact, in the first article that was published by McGlynn and Rackley, who are two legal scholars at Durham University, their initial proposals would have cut a swathe through the entire TV schedules, because of the way that they worded it. It was basically, if something's illegal, we shouldn't be allowing anybody to watch anything of it. So no cop shows, no nothing, right? The research, what research there has been, is it's not just that it's not conclusive. The problem is who are the people who've been researched. So there has been research with convicted rapists who may well have a particular reason for saying that, well, it was the porn that made me do it, or it was this representation that made me do it. But equally, you know, yeah, there are problems here in terms of thinking about how people engage with particular kinds of material. And some research has demonstrated that, in fact, between 40 and 60% of women have interest in depictions or imaginings of forced sex scenarios. And actually, if you use the term rape, then rape scenarios, then actually that number goes down, but to about 33%. But using the term forced sex can take it up to about 80%, depending on the population that's being looked at. And that actually, when it comes to defining rape and forced sex, there wasn't a significant difference between those two categories for people in the 80% or indeed in the 30-odd group. So the research base is a very mixed bag, but the idea that we should move forward to legislation on the basis of what we have currently is a real problem.
I completely agree that searching for evidence-based research to draw a direct link between what we look at and some phenomenon that gets acted out in the real world is a very simplistic way of looking at this, as is calling for sort of having arguments about any kind of evidence-based research. It's always much more complex than that. So, but maybe it's time to move on to a different terrain. And the different terrain to which I would like it to move is in terms of discourses. The discourses that are constantly constructed within pornography is that in some sense women's bodies are available, that's at one end of the spectrum, and at the other that they're extremely rapeable. Violence can be committed against them. The discourse itself is structured. It's largely women whose bodies are available in this way. So we could dispense with is there a correlation between somebody looking at pornography where a woman is raped and going out and raping somebody, which is clearly quite ridiculous. But looking at the very real phenomenon that in pornography there are discourses around violence towards women, which is clearly to me something that we should take extremely seriously.
Well, and I think we should take it seriously in other forms of representation too. Violence against women is an extremely serious subject. The problem is, though, that when you're talking about pornography in that singular way, there's lots of pornography and lots of pornographic discourses. And whether or not, in fact, there is a lot of so-called rape porn around is open to question. Whether or not this is a debate that we should be having, but we don't, right? And we don't have it because there is talk about porn being one thing, and it is always about women. And it isn't always about women, actually. It is often about men too, right? But that element gets left out because it doesn't fit well with the idea that women need protecting. And I do think that there are a range of debates we should have, and we should have very open discussion of what pornography might be, what it might do. That isn't, though, for me, I certainly don't go down the line of thinking that then we can decide what is good or bad pornography, right? I definitely don't think that that's an option for us. And one of the problems that I think with the legislation is that we hand that over to the police. I hope there are no police or members of the CPS, Because actually my experience as being an expert witness in a number of cases under the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act is that they have no bloody idea what they're doing. And they couldn't care less, right? That actually, one of the things that happens constantly is people bring up Simon Walsh's case as, oh, that was an injustice. Well, the other 4 cases I've been involved in were actually worse, because this wasn't somebody, the individuals there were not highly educated men with lots of friends and access to great legal advice and stuff. By accident, they found good legal advice, which is just as well, because their materials, most of you, I'm pretty certain most people, while they may not like them, would not think they were worth going to prison for 3 years over. And that we've handed over, you know, because this is how this stuff works, really, is that once it's rendered illegal, then we cannot revoke that law. It will not be revoked. There was a campaign to have it at the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act revoked at the beginning of the coalition. Absolutely not. That didn't go ahead. And now what we've got is an overlaying of a bad law with even more bad law, without debate, without discussion, without evidence, without any kind of proper investigation of motivations even. So that's...
We can come back to these issues in a round table, I think, but we're going to have to move on to Lucy. So hold your questions. We'll come back to it at the end.
Okay, so my talk is a little bit different. I'm going to be talking slightly more about the experience of women who are involved in producing erotica or pornography. And specifically, I'm looking at, I'm going to be talking more about their experience as producers of porn generally. I'm going to have to give you some background to what this wider project is about. You'll be a bit bemused, some of you. So I was specifically looking at women who produce and consume gay male erotica and pornography. And I think this is quite interesting because and the women who are involved in this acknowledge this too. It circumvents quite a lot of the current debates we're talking about in porn, about porn necessarily involving exploitation of women. Obviously, we could argue it still involves exploitation of men. I'm not saying it gets rid of those issues around exploitation, but it certainly kind of circumnavigates this idea that porn is inherently gendered, where things are done to women, and we have to be concerned about women's consent. So why I kind of got into this is I'm kind of used to my kind of area of research is around sex work. And I looked at this as there's basically very, very little research on, well, there's very little research generally on women and how they can consume porn. But the research that is done looks more at them consuming heterosexual porn, or to a lesser extent lesbian porn. And the fact that women might be interested in gay male porn is ignored. There is some work around, you know, the male as erotic object, but that tends again to look very much from within a gay perspective. And only makes anecdotal reference to why women, straight women, queer women, bisexual women, whoever, might be interested in watching men having sex with each other. And on top of that, I've been a writer of erotica for a really long time. I wrote erotic stories at Boston around school when I was like 8. You can argue whether that's got anything to do with child exploitation. So I was already involved in several kind of erotic writing circles, and I'd read some kind of gay male erotica and was like, hey, this is really interesting, and for me personally, I can engage with this without the various ethical concerns I have as a feminist sometimes when I look at heterosexual erotic pornography. That's obviously just my perspective. So the work that had been done around women being interested in gay male pornography historically tended to have 2 kind of roots. First was work looking at manga, especially like yaoi, Y-A-O-I. Work. So in Japan, there's a lot of comic books and kind of TV shows, cartoon TV shows that look at what's termed boy love. So there's research done around this. A lot of quite interesting comments on this, which I'll come back to. So Mark McClellan talks about how there's been a kind of slightly salacious interest, when it is mentioned in passing, sort of by the media, and why women might be interested in this. But he says, hey, no one questions that boys like watching girl-on-girl action. So isn't it quite sexist to assume that if women are going to engage in pornography, they'd automatically only want to watch heterosexual porn or lesbian porn. Like, no one questions that men might be interested in lesbians, so why couldn't women be interested in gay porn? And the second area where this research has come from is from something called slash fiction, which is kind of based on fan fiction, which is where people take characters from TV shows and kind of write stories about them, or produce art about them, or videos or so on. And there's been a big history going back from the 60s of women kind of engaging with media products, TV shows, where you have two males who are best buds, the hero and his sidekick, very little romantic interest for either of them, just this kind of love story, really, between the two of them. And if one of them was a girl, clearly they would probably at some point get it on because they're soulmates. But we never actually see that happening. So the one which is sort of like historically the kind of granddaddy of all this is Star Trek. It's just to quickly show you what they're talking about when they're talking about the sexual tension between the two male leads. Here's a little clip for you.
Anything from the landing party? I should be sending up a report momentarily, Captain. Something wrong? Like a kink in my back. Push hard. Take it. Thank you, Yoma, that's sufficient.
Push harder, Mr. Spock. Oh, sorry, thank you, that's sufficient. And if his boyfriend's angry with him, that is a pretty handy note. You're mine. So that's kind of what a lot of this fiction is based on. And work has kind of come within fan fiction has kind of pointed out that actually this is pretty much the only area of pornography which belongs exclusively to women. So we have these kind of, it used to be run sort of through zines, and now with the internet obviously it's generally done on internet groups. And this is women producing the content, women reading the content, women running the websites, women running the conferences. Basically there is almost zero male involvement. You do get occasionally the odd gay male coming along and kind of being interested in it, but essentially this is a very female space. And so Driscoll, in her work on it, said the fact that, this kind of fan fiction, so this kind of work looking at two men together, is the only form of pornography mainly produced and consumed by women is quite important for what it says about the gendering of porn. And that possibly kind of slash fiction might be an answer to Angela Carter's call for a moral pornography. That would be the tool of historically situated women rather than a law under which they serve. So in terms of my research, I've been using constructed grounded theory. The data I'm going to be talking about is from a mixture of focus groups and a questionnaire. So far I've had 377 responses, and obviously feedback is welcome because it's still at a kind of nascent stage. I also feel I should point out, obviously, this is the first time I've ever done anything kind of ethnographic, and I think also relating to some of the points that Catherine and Ava raised this morning, it's quite interesting to me about what it means to be invested in the community you're researching. So when I asked my respondents, would it be an issue for you if I didn't also produce this kind of erotica, and yes, I have also written slash fan fiction, a lot of them felt that it would be. And there's a real suspicion against outside researchers coming in. They talk a lot about feeling like they're being poked with sticks, or normals or mundanes are coming and lifting up their rock, and they don't like it, they feel it's exploitative, that it's creepy, that people have a kind of prurient interest in it. It's all about the sex and not about the kind of support women get from these groups, or universe building, or the creative process more generally. So definitely interesting for me in terms of I don't think I could do this research if I wasn't identified, at least partially, as being one of the people I'm looking at. So just some quick demographic information. I'll go through this very quickly, but you'll see there's quite a broad range of ages in the sample. There's quite a broad range of sexuality. There's quite a broad range of relationship statuses. And then obviously these are women who write erotica, so they don't necessarily consume visual pornography, but you'll see the majority of them do also consume visual pornography. And they also tend to read heterosexual erotica, watch heterosexual pornography, read lesbian erotica, and watch lesbian porn. So we are sort of talking about women who tend to be general consumers of various kinds of erotica and pornography. Not all of them, but certainly a significant proportion. But with a preference here for gay male erotica. And also, although obviously I would stress lots of other things going. It's not just sex I'm talking about here, and the response will be very clear about that. But nevertheless, you can see here that obviously this kind of sexual element, sexual excitation, and so on, is a big part of consuming this material. So the writers also, you'll see like roughly half of them also write heterosexual erotic fiction, and half of them write from a female perspective, as well as from a male perspective, although there is a preference here for the male perspective. Well, overall there's no preference when it comes down to a binary decision. So what I'm briefly going to be talking about first is this question here. So this is kind of coming from the writers. Do they think how women use and interact with porn or erotica is changing? And there definitely was, as you can see, a large agreement that yes, it was. So a lot of women talked about how they found this whole process quite empowering, how they felt that women were beginning to regain control over their own sexuality, that it was no longer just bad girls who liked porn, and that women could have sexual identities of their own that could include engagement with pornographic or erotic material, and open kind of expression of interest in that. And there was this idea, you see here in this bottom quote, women are beginning to break through the stereotype that says that all women want is courtship and romance and vague euphemisms for genital contact. And what women really want is courtship and romance and lots of explicit fucking. So it's not exactly that they're rejecting this kind of historical idea that women just like reading Nils and Boobs and men like hardcore rape porn. But it's this idea that, you know, perhaps this distinction between porn for men and erotica for women is getting outdated and doesn't really apply anymore. However, there was still this kind of feeling, because obviously these are women who all write gay male erotica, that it was perhaps less acceptable for women to express an interest in this. And a lot of women talked about how they felt they weren't really free to express their sexual interests in the same way men were. So echoing the point that Mark McClellan made, that whilst we see in popular discourse a lot of kind of discussion of how men might want to watch girl-on-girl action, we don't see women talking about wanting to watch men together. And again, here is the bottom respondent that says, I think most of society accepts that women are sexual in their own right, but it still shocks people that nice women write gay male porn. So a lot of my participants are really aware of the fact that porn traditionally catered for the male market, as a lot of media product has done historically. And they were kind of pleased, they felt that kind of gay pornography and gay erotica offered an opportunity to kind of look at sex and look at a sex act and look at the male body without having to kind of identify with a woman in the scene or feel exploited by it or feel the pressure of the male gaze. So you can see here they felt that women aren't the only ones being gazed at anymore, and that by looking at two men together, that made them watching or consuming pornography less problematic. And that it was a good thing that women were kind of becoming the producers of pornography, as opposed to simply being passive consumers or objects. But there still kind of was this awareness amongst these women that actually the vast majority of pornography on the market still seems to be aimed at men. So here we have lots of women saying, as for the porn, I'm not so sure. When having a look at the covers of the porn DVDs in the local video store, I still don't feel addressed. And here we have, I suspect too, that women creating porn is still well outside the mainstream and will be for a while, because it's okay to want to be like men, as long as we don't, have any actual agency. So there was still this kind of feeling that most pornography was still problematic. They weren't universally accepting of all porn as being great and wonderful. And they acknowledged there were still issues with coercion, particularly in heterosexual pornography, but also in gay pornography. And you can see here, a participant saying most porn is awful, so I hope women aren't just sticking to that shit. So they're not kind of disregarding the fact that pornography is problematic and involves issues around consent and exploitation and so on. But they also emphasise a lot the fact that writing within this kind of women's owning environment was a really kind of beneficial experience for them all round. That it made them feel accepted, safe, kind of empowered in their sexuality, encouraged, and that actually they felt the response from women within these particular gay male porn environments was very positive compared to perhaps the way they'd encountered women in other aspects of their life in relation to their sexuality. So you can see here such as been saying, women are engaging with each other with curiosity and without judgment. And I think that's diametrically opposed to who we're taught to be to each other, i.e. we're supposed to be competitive and critical and judgmental, and I think that's bullshit, frankly. So talking about this kind of nice utopian area, with a particular emphasis on the fact they talked about how they saw this as kind of queer space. So because it's something which contravenes what we would normally think of as being the normal sexual orientation for someone who identifies as being a woman, it opened the door to kind of a much more utopian world where people were less concerned with binary divisions between gender and binary divisions between sexuality. And, for example, even though I gave people lots of options, they weren't very happy I'd made them define sexuality at all. I got told off a lot. And I'm like, why do I have to define? So, yes, definitely this kind of idea that it creates this kind of nice environment where women felt very positive about what they were doing and how they were consuming pornography. So, obviously, a lot of them, as writers, what came up an awful lot was talking about 50 Shades of Grey, particularly because, as I'm sure most of you know, 50 Shades of Grey is also fanfic. It's based on Twilight. So a lot of them were familiar with the author in her former life. And they spoke about this a lot. So whilst a lot of them didn't seem to particularly like the book, they felt positively about it in so much as what they saw reflected in terms of how women's interaction with erotica was changing. And this idea that it was becoming more normalised. So here we have a participant saying, I was at the swimming pool, in the changing room with the swimming pool behind the door, I heard, ooh, have you read that book? I've heard people on the plane saying, oh, I've got that, and I bought one for my mother-in-law. I'm sorry, can you imagine giving your mother-in-law one of our stories? That's just wonderful. So they're generally being quite positive about it. Although this is kind of measured, so here we have one participant saying that she's kind of concerned now that women are going to continue to, women are kind of now in this sort of like orgy of consumption of terrible written erotica and have lost all sense of trying to discern good porn from bad porn. So again, judgments, we'll say this is my judgment. But there was still this discussion about what makes good written erotica and what makes bad written erotica. And people kind of squeezing that and saying actually what's happened is it's become easier for women to access erotica and pornography. But that doesn't mean that women who wouldn't do it before are now doing it. The way women consume it has changed. It's just it's become slightly easier. And there was also some resentment. So there was also some writers who said, hey, you know, we've had this free community through zines and on the internet and through writing groups, and we've shared this with each other, and now a bunch of men have come along and decided to try and make money out of it, to try and sell porn to women, whereas it was something we used to just share with each other. So in terms of how women's engagement with pornography and erotica was changing, there were a huge amount of mentions made of the internet. Now the internet had really kind of widened women's access to pornography, and obviously, you know, Fiona and Clarissa have been talking about some of the kind of fuss around how the internet has made it easier to access pornography, and that's been seen as a bad thing. But these women were talking about the positive aspects of the internet having made it easier to access porn. So here we have a respondent saying, when I'm betting that my daughter will grow up viewing porn differently than I did. In my day, we had to go to an actual dirty video store, uphill, both ways, in the snow. So talking about how much easier the internet has made it for women to kind of access porn and look for the kind of porn that they want to consume, as opposed to having to just watch mainstream porn because that was all they could find at the video store, and so on. So there's this idea then that perhaps the internet is a kind of leveller, in so much as well as being something which is talked about in terms of promoting pornification and promoting exploitation of women through the kinds of pornographic products you can find. It's also enabled women to be much more proactive in how they choose to consume erotica and pornography and how they kind of find what they want. So as this participant says, it's now so easy to make and find the kind of porn you like, whatever kind that is, than the previous choke points of producers and wholesale buyers who kept the porn industry focused on a particular heterosexual male viewpoint and losing their grip. Plus, as the producer-consumer distinction erodes, the stigma on appearing in porn is weakening, too, and not as quickly when it's a question of getting paid. But she points out that she wishes we could go a bit further in the direction of men being allowed and encouraged to want to be sexual objects, consensually and not exclusively, to women, not just to other men. Obviously this is her opinion, but interesting. So, in terms of whether or not these women felt, this is their sort of general opinions about porn, but to conclude, I'm just going to talk about their attitudes towards their own roles as producers, and they're a lot more cautious when they started talking about this. So, you'll see that whilst a lot of them have discussed the kind of content they produce with their friends, not many have with their family, and then a lot of them spoke about it in terms of coming out as producing this kind of material. And a lot of them kind of spoke about it being a difficult experience, an embarrassing experience, about feeling judged, particularly by family members who kind of view as a freak, or as she says here, as an odd insect. Some of them are kind of more positive, and like had quite a sort of carefree approach to it, and said, you know, this participant here saying, actually, I'd be more embarrassed about admitting that I write romantic stories than admitting that I write what she calls smut. But there was a kind of awareness here for a number of the women that actually writing kind of pornographic content sat quite uncomfortably with how they felt of themselves as a political person in their day-to-day life. And that it wasn't always easy for them to reconcile this idea of self-identifying as a feminist with being a producer of explicit sexual content. So here we have one of the participants saying, most of my friends are old feminists like me, and we come from a culture of anti-porn as an industry that is solely for straight men and exploits women, and for pro-women's rights and lesbian rights. So it's been quite hard to come out as a writer of porn, and not always seen as a good thing. So then in terms of talking about whether or not they discuss their pornography use or preferences more generally with people, the majority of them didn't feel comfortable doing that. Some of them kind of did. They felt it should be part of everyday life. So we have a participant saying, I think it's like anything else. I like chocolate, wine, spaghetti, and porn, and what's wrong with that? But others kind of tend to be more circumspect about it. So the participant here says that she only really talks about her involvement in kind of watching pornography when arguments are going on, and she hears things like, all porn is anti-feminist and women don't watch porn, otherwise she wouldn't offer that information. The majority, quite a sort of minority, but a significant minority, said they didn't do it, but just for reasons of kind of feeling that that's private, that sexual fantasy, sexual preference, masturbation and so on are private things which you just don't share with other people unless they're your sexual partner. So you can see here one of them says, that's gross, I'm a classy perv. I don't want to scar anyone with too much information. But there was also an underlying sense of kind of shame and embarrassment, and a belief that this still wasn't something which was appropriate for women to do. So here a participant says, definitely, why she doesn't talk about it, internalised shame. I come from an era where pornography was dirty, 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 and no respectable woman would ever admit she used and enjoyed it. So my final point is just to kind of talk about this final issue, which is how important it still was to the vast majority of the participants to protect their identity as a writer. So nearly all of them write under pen names. Quite a few of them are also published authors, although most of their published work tends to be heterosexual erotica, and they also do that under pen names. Normally different pen names, because they don't even want their het identity mixed up with their gay porn identity and so on. And they were like, generally kind of overwhelmingly saying they didn't want anyone to find out that they were a producer of erotic content. They felt this was really dangerous. So here we have a participant saying, I'm very, very careful who knows about what I write. Writing male erotica can get you fired, lose your kids in a divorce hearing, etc. Most people are pretty apt to dump you in the same box as a paedophile. And this kind of was repeated at numerous times, particularly in terms of the risk of being fired from work. This is particularly a strong opinion in North America, but even in Europe and South America and Asia, where I had respondents, that generally was this kind of fear that if you say, yes, I write erotic fiction, particularly gay male erotic fiction, you're risking kind of professional discreditation. And some of them were also quite uncomfortable with this identity in and of itself. So it wasn't just the kind of fear of being exposed and then having social kind of judgment, social policing from other people. They also kind of felt pressure within themselves and from within their family. So we have respondents saying, it is a little because of the vague remnants of shame that having any sort of sexuality still engenders in me. I don't like the idea of of me being associated with the things my filthy-minded conjures makes me uneasy. And to another respondent saying, there are some things a daddy should not know about his baby girl. It would distress certain of my family members if they knew anything about my activities. So just kind of in conclusion would be that despite the fact that they were sort of overwhelmingly kind of saying, yes, how women consume pornography and erotica is changing, it's becoming something which women can be more involved in, they don't have to be objects anymore, they can be kind of active producers and consumers, and that there was a general feeling that was positive. There was still a deep, deep reluctance on a personal level to come out and say, I write porn, or I write erotica, or I like watching men having sex with each other. It just wasn't something they felt they were able to do. Yeah, okay, thank you. Again, time for one or two questions before a quick
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and the talk that I've been waiting for, so thank you. I have a really good question about autonomy and, not autonomy, anonymity and pen names.
Yeah.
Because lots of erotica that I've come across has androgynous pen names.
Yeah.
And I was very interested if any of your research looked at whether or not their pen names were female or were male or were androgynous.
I didn't actually ask them for their pen names when I did the survey because obviously I didn't want I couldn't put all that stuff and pry into their life. But certainly, yes, I would say the vast majority of pen names are completely androgynous. And a number of women who responded to the questionnaire, especially those who identified as genderqueer, kind of said actually that was part of the whole process for them. The reason they felt this whole genre allowed them to be less hung up on I'm a man or I'm a woman or I'm straight or I'm gay. And I think perhaps partly the adopting of these androgynous names is kind of more another way to kind of free themselves from this idea that, you know, this is straight girls are doing this and gay men are doing this. But yeah, I would agree with you. Certainly a lot of the names were not particularly easy to understand whether they be a man or a woman.
So can I just really quickly?
Yeah.
But then, don't you think that for consumers who are looking for a community of women writers, then aren't able to be in that or have any knowledge of that, who's writing what they're reading?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when I first kind of started looking at this many years ago, I didn't really realise how female-dominated it was. Then the more time you spend in those kind of communities, the more you realise that pretty much everyone you're speaking to is a woman. But yes, you're right. Superficially, going into it, you wouldn't be aware you're entering a kind of female environment. But certainly, after spending a few months there, you would become aware, I think.
Yes, you talk mainly about writers of erotica and porn, but there's also this affects whoever wants to read it and whoever wants to write it, etc.
Yeah.
What about indecent films? And also, when we talk about indecent films, they usually talk about the impact on those who watch them, again, protecting children, etc. But I never heard anyone mentioning the impact on the actors, and especially men who are forced to, etc.
Yeah. So I did ask some questions around that, and a lot of women were kind of aware of issues around being gay for pay, and that the porn industry itself could involve exploitation. But what a lot of them expressed, or how they felt, was they felt generally men tend to have more agency. Tying into what we're talking about, I guess, about the capitalist model, and men tend to have more choices than women in terms of how they make money. That was how their perception. So their perception was that a male porn actor is less likely to be in a coercive situation than a female porn actor. So I'm not saying I agree with that, but that was certainly what a lot of them were saying. They felt actually watching visual gay pornography was less problematic because they believed those people were more likely to make an active choice to do that.